pitch-bending vocals. The back and forth of voice and strings. The seeds of the blues were buried long ago, planted in the music of Africa, but harvested in the fields of the Deep South. It was the pain, the sorrow, the struggles during and after slavery that gave the blues its simple structure and its emotionally complex sound.
The blues really emerges in a bunch of different communities around the rural South at around the same time, in the late 19th to the early 20th century.
The blues takes root right after Emancipation.
Today, we pay particular attention to the Delta blues because of the number of influential musicians who came from that region of Mississippi, Arkansas.
You see its influence in Charlie Patton. You see its influence in Robert Johnson.
But you have blues performers in places like Virginia and North Carolina, what would become known as the Piedmont Blues. You have blues performers in northern Mississippi, what would become known as the Hill Country Blues. You have all these kind of regional styles that emerge at around the same time. You have this new music that reflects kind of the new situation in which Black people have found themselves after the end of slavery. So many blues songs, for example, on subjects like travel, or romantic relationships. We could think of them as explorations of the new freedoms that people had after emancipation.
Blues aesthetic is that message of encouragement in a tough time. That's kind of the ethos that the music comes from, is this idea of struggle.
In those struggles, there is a line of hope and pain that intertwines.
Segregation, Jim Crow laws. Slavery was over, but life was still brutal for Black Americans in the rural South.
After World War I, with the beginning of the Great Migration, you have African Americans moving from the rural South to the urban North.
They migrated further and further from their rural space into their urban spaces like Chicago, like Memphis, even New York. So they brought with them that sound as they moved into the cities.
You have blues becoming an important part of show business and vaudeville shows, and that's where you have the success of, in particular, women blues singers like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith.
Women play a significant role in the blues sound, and Ma Rainey is a perfect example of an entertainment entrepreneur. She leveraged her sound so that she can directly profit from her talent versus someone else profiting from her talent. Seeing herself as an entity and her sound as an entity set a standard and an example, as well as a blueprint for modern female artists.
In Chicago, you have the development of what would become known as the urban blues. So you have the replacement of acoustic instruments like the acoustic guitar with the electric guitar.
You have people like B.B. King. I mean, when he gets on that guitar, he's bending and doing all of the cries and the growls of struggle, you know, and letting that out in the music. And these wailing guitars, these bends and the cries, people would have guitars trying to sound like the human voice. That was the beginning of rock and roll.
Three blues artists who were important in laying the groundwork or bridging the gap between the blues and rock and roll. One would be Big Mama Thornton, her song Hound Dog, then of course made famous by Elvis Presley. You have Muddy Waters, the great Mississippi transplant to Chicago blues musician, whose music would become the most important inspiration for the Rolling Stones. And then T-Bone Walker, whose music was a very important element of what would become R&B.
You don't have American music without the blues. The blues music opened a door and enabled an artist to tell their story on a popular stage, rather than limiting their emotion to their home, to their church. Now on stage, there can be an emotional camaraderie.
It's the relatability of the music, the realism of the music. The blues is about depicting and then wrestling with the difficulties of life, and then also kind of celebrating the joys of life in these very frank terms. And that was a completely new thing in music in the early 20th century. You know, there's none of the sentimentality that you see in other popular music of that period. And that's why the music has endured for so long, because looking honestly at the circumstances of life is always going to be refreshing.
The blues came from lone voices in the deep South, but it carried through generations across the whole world, changing music forever. Its structure, its style, yeah, it's simple, but what it means, what it stands for, the sorrow, the pleasure, that stuff is profound. And that tug of war between passion and pain that makes the blues speak to everyone who hears it.
Want to get a closer look at the impact of Black music in America? Visit and support the National Museum of African American Music at nmaam.org.